Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. One thing that Star Wars fans love doing is fantasizing about what their lives would be like if they actually lived in the Star Wars galaxy. Would they join the Jedi? Would they join the Empire or the Rebel Alliance? I've always loved this thought exercise, so let's bring that thought exercise here to Earth. What would happen if the Galactic Empire appeared, over New York City with their Star Destroyers and let's say we knew nothing about the Galactic Empire, like we can't see in the movies, that would be cheating. How many of us would actually just surrender and join the Empire, and how many of us would actually fight? The number I keep coming up with is, I think anywhere around 7 to 8 out of 10 individuals would actually join the Empire and not resist. And I'm not just pulling this number out of my ass, guys. I actually have some studies that I want to cite later on in this video to explain why I think this way. I mean, you guys remember how it all went down, right? It's not like Palpatine just came out of nowhere with a bunch of stormtroopers and Star Destroyers and just executed the Jedi. It all happened gradually in small bits and pieces, and Palpatine usually had a really good reason for taking more control beneath the executive position. First, it was Jar Jar Binks suggesting that emergency powers should be granted to Palpatine, which would extend his term and give him the rights to establish a military force. Then it was multiple bills to increase funding for that military, and eventually Palpatine started nationalizing entire companies, industries, and he even nationalized the banking system. For Palpatine, it was all about grabbing control because of the great evil threat that was the Separatist crisis. Extraordinary circumstances called for extraordinary actions. I mean, had you interviewed the trillions of Republic citizens who probably supported Palpatine during the war and asked them what they thought about Palpatine being a dictator or an authoritarian, they would have probably just laughed it off and scoffed. Again, extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary action.
The Emperor's primary charge is to protect us, is it not? And that's what the PORD legislation will do.
Now, there would be a percentage of people who wholeheartedly agree with Palpatine's actions here. They would probably vote for him no matter what the situation was. These are individuals who naturally align with the law and order narrative. They're pro-Republic loyalists, maybe, who are against the Separatist movement. And there'd be many other smaller factions whose interests align with Palpatine's here. But at the same time, there'll also be a lot of people who are against Palpatine. They're dissenters.
How much protection is enough?
We know what too little looks like.
Surveillance and prosecution, without limit.
You're doing nothing wrong. What is there to fear?
Well, I'm fearing your definition of wrong.
These are dangerous times.
The varied voices we actually hear at this dinner party are a good representation of the various voices that existed in the Empire during this period of time, probably. There are different views and different concerns. The only problem with an empire like the one run by Palpatine is that once you elect an individual like him, the state will actively get rid of any voices who dares criticize and resist his rule. And so the portion that will rebel will suffer a harsh crackdown, whereas the portion who supports Palpatine will most likely see their wishes get fulfilled. They might even be rewarded by some kickbacks from the central government. But what about the centrists in the middle, who are not committed to either side and most likely are not even that focused on politics in the first place? It's actually larger groups, the majority, that delivered the Republic directly into Emperor Palpatine's hands. And so what happened? Why would regular, everyday, moderate voters elect a dictator or madman into power? Is it reflective of their views? Or is it perhaps reflective of something a bit simpler and more natural about human society? Now, while we're on this topic, I thought it'd be a great time to mention our sponsor for today's video, Ground News. The quickest way for a free society to vote in a tyranny onto itself is by having a clogged up information flow. In today's world, it's not censorship that we have to fear, but the fatigue and burnout we experience from being bombarded by just too much information. Ground News is an independently funded news aggregator, which can help you sort through all the news stories of the day and bring you to the most important headlines. For instance, I went over the US economy tab and found this story. Biden to cut China off from more NVIDIA chips, expand curbs for more countries. If we take a look at the bias distribution box, we can tell that this story has balanced coverage from the left, center, and right. Most of the center-leaning publications are focused on putting Biden in the title, highlighting the president's role in this effort, whereas the right-leaning publications talk more about the hurdles that these efforts might place for American semiconductor companies like Intel, who up until these recent bans had a massive presence in the Chinese market. It makes sense for right-leaning publications to focus on this because traditional fiscal conservatives are free trade oriented and against protectionism. Although the more recent populist right movement is not really fiscally conservative at all and for protectionism. They just don't want to see Joe Biden doing that, which is probably why there's no articles from populist right publications here. And then you have the left-leaning publications, which all cover the story from a very straightforward point of view. Ground news won't make you smarter overnight, but it will help you become a more experienced and faster consumer of news. And being informed in today's world is incredibly important. I actually use ground news for a lot of my research about this world, which I then later on connect to my Star Wars lore videos. Also, as an investor who's really interested in the American semiconductor manufacturing boom in recent years, I want to know what's going on. For more information about ground news, use my link in the description down below to get 30% off of a Vantage subscription for ground news and get access to advanced features like my news bias, which helps keep track of what you read and politically where those readings lean towards. Thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. During the post-World War II era, one of the biggest questions that sociologists, psychologists, and other great thinkers posed was how could Germany, this democratic and free country, vote in such a crazy and evil madman like Hitler? It's the same question I'm sure many New Republic historians asked about the rise of Palpatine and his empire. I mean, it's easy in hindsight to see that Palpatine was a madman, just as it's easy now to see that Hitler was also a madman. But at the time when these individuals took power, they hadn't revealed their true, intentions. And so a lot of people were just wowed and stunned and shocked.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
Padme Amidala probably would have enjoyed the company of Lutheran pastor and anti-Nazi dissident Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He too was stunned that his fellow German citizens, as smart and enlightened as they were, would vote for someone as cruel and evil as Hitler. Bonhoeffer would openly campaign against Hitler in the public, and perhaps he was a bit too naive about just how far his country had fallen, and he would end up writing his most famous theory, Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity, while rotting away in Flossenburg concentration camp. Neither protest nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears. Facts that contradict one's prejudgment simply need not be believed. In such moments, the stupid person even becomes critical. And when facts are irrefutable, they are just pushed aside as inconsequential, as incidental. In all this, the stupid person, in contrast to the malicious one, is utterly self-satisfied, and being easily irritated becomes dangerous by going on the attack. Yes, it's the stupid ones. These are the ones that Bonhoeffer blames for the rise of the Nazi regime. These are the individuals who knowingly voted in an authoritarian regime and destroyed their own power as voters. These are individuals who applauded as Chancellor Palpatine was granted emergency power shortly after the discovery of the Separatist droid army. These were individuals who were excited for warfare, not knowing exactly what that entailed and how much destruction it would do to the galaxy. These are the same individuals who believed in the Nazis' propaganda, that it was Jews and Marxists that were responsible for the terrible living standards and widespread unemployment that Germany went through in the 1930s, instead of looking at the real culprit, the Great Depression, and overly harsh war reparation payments levied by the League of Nations after the last war. It was these same idiots who believed in the Aryan master race, as if race was anything more than a social construct designed to, falsely divide us into different groups. Populist movements always tap into simple to understand solutions for overly complex political and economic problems, which generally always leads to disasters because you generally need complicated solutions to complicated problems. Palpatine destroyed entire industries in order to boost the Empire's military-industrial complex. By the end of World War II, Germany's industrial and agricultural might had been crushed, and the majority of their cities had been flattened by Allied bombing campaigns. But stupidity alone doesn't lead to the election of malicious actors and dictators. Every country in the world has a small group of left-wing and right-wing activists that are just sitting there, and usually during good times, they don't get any traction in the polls. But in times of crisis, like the Separatist crisis, with multiple corpo states and planets threatening to leave the Republic, suddenly extreme political action seemed necessary. Or in 1929, here on Earth, when the Great Depression occurred, wiping out massive amounts of household wealth. Extreme times led to voters seeking extreme solutions. If you take a look at the Nazi Party before the 1930s, they never received more than single-digit voter outcomes. But then the Great Depression had hit, and by 1930, in wider elections, the Nazi Party had received 18% of the votes, and then by 1932, it received around 33% of the votes. In a parliamentary system where you have multiple parties, 33% might not be the majority, but it's just enough for a party to be given a chance to try to form a coalition that has the majority, and in this case, also give the leader of that party, who happened to be Adolf Hitler, a chance to become the Chancellor of Germany, which was a huge problem. But what followed afterwards is perhaps the most horrifying part of the story. Adolf Hitler bullied his way through the political process. He used voter intimidation and propaganda to eventually win even more support. Now, I have to say, during this time, opposition forces actually had more members than the Nazi Party, but you had groups like the Communist Party, which was backed by Moscow. They viewed the Social Democratic Party, which was a center-left-leaning German party, as fascist, simply because they weren't as left-wing as them, and as a result, they can never coalesce all of their power and votes together to try to fight against the Nazis. Within a year, that wouldn't matter at all because all of these other political parties would just be banned. Germany had democratic elected a fascist government into power, and all future elections, they, surprise, would win every election by at least 90%. So what happens? What happened to all of these skeptics? The individuals who voted for the Center Party, the Communist Party, the Social Democratic Party, together they had enough votes to rival the Nazis. Where did all these people go? Were they oppressed? Were they locked up? Did they self-censor? I know a lot of people were just probably terrified by what was happening and they decided to be quiet. Well, I actually think there's another more powerful force working here, something that would allow a pretty neutral and liberal country to turn into a fascist nation within the course of just a few years. I mean, how did the old republic go from not having a federal military force for more than 1,000 years through just accepting a clone army that appeared out of thin air? Well, what does the suppression of opposition create? Well, it creates a sense of fear for people to not want to speak out, and that actually changes public perception. And public perception, well, that can be everything for people, especially who are uneducated or who do not understand what's going on. Instead of doing their own research, they'll basically just look at the masses and follow along. It's called conformity. In the 1950s, Polish-American Solomon Elliott Ash conducted a series of experiments to get to the bottom of what drives conformity at the societal level. Now, Solomon, a Jew, grew up in Poland, and his family actually ends up leaving the country in 1920. For those of you who are not very familiar with Earth history, it's kind of like leaving Alderaan in one BBY. It's good timing. Ash originally had been fascinated with the anthropology field like George Lucas. I actually think these two could have struck up quite the conversation. They were interested in how human societies were built and how people think. In his conformity trial, Ash would collect a group of 7 to 8 individuals. Ash would present the group with 2 cards. One card had a picture of a line, and another picture had 3 lines of different heights. Ash would ask each individual to match the first line with one of the 3 lines in the second card. Now, the thing is, everyone in this group, except for one individual, is an actor. They're in on the experiment. And they were all instructed to point at the wrong line. You see, the lone individual who's actually being experimented on believes that he is partaking in a visual perception test, when in fact, the researchers are trying to get all of these actors to make him conform to a completely wrong decision. And I gotta say, the results are not encouraging. They found that only 26% of individuals consistently defied majority opinion, which means that they chose the right line no matter what everyone else tried to say, while 12% conformed to the majority opinion most of the time and selected the wrong opinion every time, whereas 62% of the population occasionally conformed. This study would actually be replicated across the planet with different cultures, different demographics, and very similar numbers were found. And so I guess the results are that only a quarter of people are staunchly independent thinkers, which means that 75% of us have the tendency to conform in varying degrees. There is also further correlations between how many people were applying the peer pressure and how willing a person was to conform. When it was only one person, 3% of people chose the wrong line, but by the time that number went up to 4, around 30% would be convinced to choose the wrong line by the group. And herein lies the truth about society. Most of us are followers. Even the contrarians will have some type of conformity in their life to one thing or another. I mean, this is why you have entire contrarian movements that conform to things, right? You guys remember Hot Topic back in the day? And it's not just a negative thing. I mean, it's in human nature to follow and trust the pack. It's how we share information and save time learning about whether things are safe or not. The problem is, I think a lot of dictators, authoritarian, just malicious actors out there understand this, and they're more than willing to exploit this because they lack morals. I mean, I can imagine someone being a firm supporter of democracy and liberty becoming extremely frustrated when you realize that the majority of voters aren't nearly as well informed as you would think, and that most are voting upon party lines or for groups that their friends, family, or religious groups are interested in. You know, dictators take a look at this and they love it. They're like, why don't I just follow this narrative that most people are stupid and that most people are followers? Dictators really do well in environments where people become cynical about the election process, about the voting system, when they think that their fellow Americans are stupid or evil or hateful people. This is the kind of divisiveness that authoritarians need to actually gain power. You know, this is why democracies have always required the highest amount of courage from its elected officials and voting populace. It's all about sharing power with people you might fundamentally disagree with. And that is what also makes democracies work so well. It's that disagreement, those checks and balances. And during more stable and prosperous times, well, most people don't get that politically active, actually. They're too busy focusing on their family, on their job, on just enjoying life. I mean, take a look at the United States. We're a nation that is known for having a pretty low voter turnout in executive elections. The number usually hovers around 50 to 60%. So when President Trump claims he won the 2020 election because he had 11 million more votes in 2020 compared to 2016, he had 74 million instead of 63 million, what exactly happened? Where did these 11 million people come from? So here's the thing. If you take a look at the 2020 elections, there was an 8% increase in voter turnout compared to 2016. And while Donald Trump did get 11 million more votes than he did in 2016, Joe Biden actually ends up with 16 million more votes than Hillary Clinton did at the end of 2016. And that's still 7 million more than Trump. If Trump has anything to brag about here, it's actually that his presence encouraged more Americans to come out to vote. Unfortunately for him, that meant that more people came out to vote against him than for him, right? And this should give us a better understanding of the truth of elections. Small extreme groups like the Nazis, like Emperor Palpatine's Comp Nor fanatics, can easily take power, even if they don't have the numbers initially. If they can be perceived to be strong, which is something that the Nazis and the Empire loved doing, they had their giant tanks, their nice uniforms, their gigantic Star Destroyers, right? This is all designed to create inspiration and fear at the same time. The idea is if the public perceives that everyone supports the government, then everyone will be too afraid to step out of line. That is conformity. Yes, individuals like Luthen Rael Monmouth, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Klaus von Stauffenberg were true rebels, and these individuals are extremely important at keeping the embers of rebellion alive and well, while the rest of us just sit at home, nice and safe. And as I mentioned before, you know, generally people who are in the first wave of any rebellion are kind of unique, special, or just straight up troubled individuals. You either have bored elitists who have more than enough time and resources on their hands to get involved in these kind of matters. Bail Organa and his daughter Leia are a great example of this, as is Mon Mothma. Or you have desperate individuals who have no choice but to try and fight against tyranny. Cassian Andor isn't your typical rebel at first, but his criminal activities certainly put him in a great position to resist the Empire. The same thing could be said about Jyn Erso. Most of us are not these people. Most of us are like the hardworking individuals of Ferrix. Like Simple Tim, who's just trying to get it in with Bix Caleen. Most of us are like Brasso, who's just trying to make an honest living. So what pushes the middle to act on Ferrix? Well, in this case, it was the defiant actions of Cassian Andor, the speech of Marva, and perhaps the cruelty of this Imperial officer who attacks a beloved droid in the wide open. It's the brave actions of a few individuals who awaken all of Ferrix. And I gotta say, you know, it could have easily gone the other way if things had changed just a little bit. What if the incident with Cassian had killed bystanders? What if the Empire had controlled the narrative and suddenly the people of Ferrix view individuals like Cassian as the enemy? People could have embraced Imperial rule on Ferrix, making it much harder for those who oppose the Emperor to operate. And so I guess your voice does matter. The next time someone tells you to shut your mouth and tries to censor you, or you self-censor yourself because you're afraid of what other people will think, maybe don't do that. realize that the majority of people are just sitting there and waiting for someone to act. I mean, you guys remember when you were kids, the classroom was basically like this. You had one bully who would start picking on a nerdy kid, and then 15 kids in the classroom would just stay silent and see how others would react to this. And you had maybe one kid who had the ability to stand up against his bully and tell him, hey, stop, like give Timmy back his shoes. What the hell's wrong with you, you know? And if that person doesn't say that, it's very likely for the entire crowd to just go with the bully and normalize this behavior towards the kid who's getting bullied. And if you don't stop that bully, maybe one day he'll just end up in the business world or become a lawyer and continue to operate without impunity, without anyone defying their worldview. Maybe one day that bully gets a presence in the public space and runs for office, and maybe once he's in office, he'll decide to hold that position for life. And so realize this, if you're an independent individual, you're that contrarian, you're that 25% of people in that study who chose the right thing, no matter what, no matter how much peer pressure was placed onto you, you actually have a huge responsibility to society. Bullies will always seek power. They will always go into places trying to gather more and more control. Contrarians, on the other hand, they generally don't want to be involved with the rest of society and they want to do their own thing, but the truth is, without you contrarians out there, without independent minds, society could collapse. We're highly dependent on those outside of the box thinkers. In the Empire, it went the other way. The masses followed the wrong side and brought great suffering to everyone in existence. 60 million people died because of World War II. The German people stood aside and allowed their Jewish neighbors to get kicked out of their homes, robbed, raped, placed in work camps, and eventually slaughtered in death camps in the millions. And these weren't all straight up Nazis. These were normal people, like the person who runs the gas station, nurses, teachers, postmen, all had a role to play in this incredibly evil period of human history. So there you have it, guys. I guess that is our video today. It's an important reminder that, again, if you do have a voice and if you believe in something and if you believe that thing is right, you live in a society where you're allowed to say whatever the hell you want. For the most part, you should exercise that right. Use your voice. Don't be afraid of going against the grain. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. See you next time.
You know, I was almost drafted. Imagine me serving.
Oh, darling, that was the Empire.
Oh, my apologies. Empire, Rebels, New Republic, I can't keep track. That's why I should just keep my mouth shut.
We try not to get involved.